All right, let's get right into this explainer of Dr. Robert A. Peterson's theological framework, breaking down the complex roles and actions of Christ from Hebrews 1. The source material we're looking at today unpacks some truly massive theological concepts, and it organizes them into two main buckets: the three historical offices that Christ holds, and the 9 specific events that make up his saving work. Whether you've studied these ancient texts for decades or you're just jumping in today, this framework totally shifts how we look at the architecture of this theology. I'm really excited to guide you through exactly what these sources are saying. To make sense of all this, we're going to follow a pretty straightforward roadmap. We'll look at the ultimate mediator, the great prophet, the perfect priest, the exalted king, and finally wrap up with the 9 saving events. All right, part 1. The ultimate mediator. The shift in Revelation. So here's what that shift actually looks like, as the source material contrasts how God's message was delivered across different eras. Hebrews 1 sets up this incredible timeline. Think about it. In the Old Testament, God's message came through, a bunch of different mediators: prophets, angels, Moses bringing the law. But then the text draws this huge contrast. It goes from those many times and many ways of the past to these last days, where the message comes through one single, superior source, the Son. It's a total shift from a fragmented message to a unified one. I mean, if an ancient message delivered by angels demanded absolute obedience, right? Imagine the weight of a message brought by the ultimate mediator. It literally demands our absolute closest attention. Moving right along to part 2, the great prophet, the supreme revealer. The source text doesn't just throw dry definitions at us, it gives us this brilliant, vivid imagery from Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. It calls the Son the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. These aren't just, pretty poetic words. They're super precise first-century metaphors, showing exactly how the Creator bridges the gap to become the supreme revealer. They illustrate how someone can be entirely equal to God, but distinct enough to actually reveal him to us. To really grasp this, we've got to talk about the ancient theological term homoousios, which basically means of the exact same essence or same substance. Think of the sun and its rays. The sunlight hitting your face isn't made of some completely different element than the sun itself, right? It literally is the sun, beamed across space. You couldn't just walk up to the core of the sun without burning up, but the rays manifest it so we can actually experience the light. That's the whole point of the metaphor. The rays are equal in nature to the sun, but their role is to reveal it. And that perfectly captures this prophetical role, the Son actively revealing the Father. And it's the exact same idea with the whole imprint thing. Back in the ancient world, if you wanted to mint a coin, you'd take a soft piece of metal, smash it into a die with a heavy hammer, and boom, you get a perfect, exact match of the die. Not just kinda similar, but the exact imprint. Humans might be described as being made in the image of God, but only the Son is the exact imprint of his nature. This amazing crossing of the creator-creature divide. That's exactly what makes him the supreme prophet and revealer. Okay, part 3, the perfect priest, the finished work. Now check out this specific emphasis on physical posture here. He sat down. You might just gloss over that, but it's actually a massive theological pivot. In ancient temples, priests literally never sat. There weren't any chairs in the tabernacle. Why? Because a priest's work was never, ever done. Day in, day out, it was just a constant, endless cycle of sacrifices. So, a priest actually taking a seat? That changes everything. It signifies that the ultimate sacrifice is 100% complete and effective. By sitting down at the right hand of God, it's a bold statement that the work is finished. The Father has fully accepted the sacrifice and literally no further purification or merit is required. It is done. And honestly, this matters so much because of the impact it has on the believer. For the original audience, this meant absolute freedom from that exhausting cycle of ritual and anxiety. It shifts the entire human experience from constantly trying to earn purification to just resting in a work that's already been totally finished on their behalf. Which brings us to part 4, the exalted king, superior to angels. To prove this royal superiority, the text lays out 5 classic proofs of deity. And the source material actually points out that it's super rare to find a single chapter in the Bible that crams all 5 of these massive concepts together quite like this. Let's walk through them, because they form the entire foundation of this kingship. First up, divine essence. That's the radiance and exact imprint we just talked about. Second, divine titles, where the Father explicitly calls the Son God and Lord. Third, divine works, crediting the Son with creating the universe and literally upholding it by the word of his power. Fourth is divine worship, which we'll look at in just a sec. And fifth, divine attributes, specifically immutability, meaning, in a chaotic world that wears out and changes like an old piece of clothing, this king remains exactly the same. When you stack all 5 of these proofs together, the text leaves absolutely zero room for doubt about who is sitting on that throne. And speaking of worship, look at this. By pointing out that angels are commanded to worship the sun, the text firmly establishes that vital creator-creature distinction. Throughout the Bible, whenever an angel or a human is offered worship, they shut it down immediately. They rip their clothes, they yell stand up, because worship is strictly, solely for God. But here, the Father actively commands the entire heavenly host to worship the Son. It's the ultimate undeniable proof of his exalted divine royal status. All right, final section, part 5, 9 saving events, what the Son accomplished. So, now that we've established exactly who Christ is through those 3 offices, let's zoom out and look at the broader timeline of what he actually accomplished. Dr. Peterson organizes these 9 distinct saving events into 3 phases: prerequisites, core events, and ramifications. The first grouping is all about those essential prerequisites. Remember that huge creator-creature divide we talked about earlier? The incarnation bridges that, the creator becoming a creature, and the sinless life acts as the rock-solid foundation. Without these first 2 steps firmly in place, honestly, nothing that follows would carry any saving weight whatsoever. Next up are the core events, death and resurrection. And listen, this is vital. These absolutely must be viewed as an inseparable unit. You literally cannot have one without the other in this framework. While a lot of people focus almost entirely on the cross, the source text stresses that the resurrection itself is an active, essential saving event. Like the Apostle Paul famously said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. These 2 events, seamlessly locked together, are the absolute beating heart of this entire framework. Finally, the sequence cascades into these 5 essential results, representing the ongoing and future ramifications of that core saving work. Think of it like a massive domino effect of salvation. First, he ascends back to heaven. Then comes the session, meaning he takes that seated posture of the perfect priest and king we discussed earlier, resting in his finished work. Well, that exact seated position triggers Pentecost, sending the Spirit to empower his followers. And from that throne, he continuously intercedes and advocates for his people. Ultimately, this whole sweeping timeline culminates in the future event of his second coming. It is so cool how it beautifully connects those historical offices we explored earlier right into this massive, ongoing timeline of action. Now, while the cross is obviously the universal symbol of this saving work, the source material brings up a really interesting ongoing debate. Do we focus so much on the death that we inadvertently neglect the empty tomb? Theologian John Stott makes a fascinating point here. He notes that while other religions have these serene, beautiful symbols, like a lotus flower or a crescent, Christianity adopted an ancient instrument of torture. It's a profound, undeniable symbol of atonement for sure, but the text suggests that relying solely on the cross might accidentally sideline the victory of the resurrection. It even advocates for visually combining the cross with the rolled-away stone, just to capture the full, complete scope of those inseparable core events. Which leaves us with this pretty provocative thought. Are we missing half the story of salvation by only looking at the cross and neglecting the resurrection as an actual saving event? If we really accept this intricate framework, from the 3 distinct offices bridging heaven and earth to that massive 9-event domino effect, we're challenged to look at this theology as more than just a single tragic moment in ancient history. It's a triumphant, ongoing, continuous reality. Definitely something to think about the next time you encounter these ancient texts.